say, what do you want me to do? Just general chuntering? And we said, yes, please, Ken. And he always did it brilliantly well, bless him. Lovely fellow. I've put a date on me, but I remember Ken from 1945, when he was Captain Ken Slater of Operation Fantast, and he had a postal address via the army in Germany. But that was, so that's how long ago our Ken has been around in the worlds of science fiction and fantasy. What I'd like to pick up on, I think, first is a couple of, just double check that my pals in the back row can hear without a mic. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, they tell me there's very little danger of that. I won't say the only, but one of the most frequent kind-hearted comments I get from elderly members of church congregations is that when I do a visit to a church I haven't been to for in a while, when the regular chap is away, some dear old friend at the back of the church saying, I did enjoy your sermon, Father, I could hear you, I couldn't hear the others. It reminds me of a lovely old Methodist local preacher who'd gone deaf. He was in his 90s, but he still attended church. Lovely old fellow. He would say, he'd lean forward like this in the front row, and he would say, I only want to hear the text. If I know the text, I'll make up my own sermon. That'll be better than yours too. He would smile and nod and bless him, and but it is ever so important to make sure that the friends who've been kind enough to come and hear you are at least able to hear what you're trying to do to generally entertain. I wanted to add a few serious words to the little fun story I told you last night about Nostradamus. After we had the quiz and the Nostradamus episode came up, I filmed that for Roger Bolton in 1999, and of course 1999 was the Nostradamus quatrain, in which in the 7th month of the year 1999, then, and this is where it all went horrendously wrong, in the first edition, the printer had got it right, and there was no apostrophe in the next line, which went, Le Roi de Frayeur, but de Frayeur spelt all one word, D-E-F-F, and so on. But in the second edition, which circulated far more widely, the printer in his wisdom had put an apostrophe after the D. So it became Le Roi de Frayeur. And that single apostrophe changes the medieval French totally. If his de Frayeur, as Nostradamus originally wrote it, and as his first conscientious printer published it, it should simply be the nice king who picks up the tab for you and defrays your expenses, one who helps the poor, one who clothes the naked, one who feeds the hungry. But you shove that deadly apostrophe in and you get effrayeur, terror. And so everybody was walking about in states of high alarm that the world was going to end on this deadly day in July of 1999. And one of the tragic things was we met a lovely guy. Any of you who saw or remembered the program, we met this lovely fellow called Matthew, who had been a fairly high-ranking civil servant in the Ministry of Education, and who had totally sold himself on the idea that it really was true and the whole world was going to end the next day. And as we were walking over Westminster Bridge and I was interviewing this, with all of this, I expect the Thames will boil, and I'm ever so sorry for you chaps, but I've done the best thing. I've sold my flat, I've sold my car, I've given up my job, and I want to die back at home. So I've gone back to I'm going back tomorrow or later tonight, the village where I was born. And after the day came and went, and nothing happened at all, we never saw Matthew again. And another unsolved mystery, they just don't know where he went. Now, how on earth do you cope with a whole cultural scenario of life, everything that you've built your life on, and suddenly you're wrong? Now, what do you do? Well, you know the lovely and true psychiatric story about the ladies who were both in the mental hospital because each of them believed that she was Mary, the Virgin Mother of Jesus. And there was a very imaginative and daring psychiatric doctor in charge of the place. And as they were both totally kind and gentle and harmless, he had a marvellous idea. I'm going to put them in a two-bedded ward together and see what happens. And of course you can imagine the scene. The first one comes in and says, "Hello, my dear, how nice. I'm Mary, Mother of Jesus." And the other one says, "Well, that's very strange, my dear, so am I." And they looked at each other, and then one of them said, "Well, I must have been wrong all these years. I tell you what, if you're Mary, then I'm St. Anne, I'm your mother." And they got on very well for the next 6 months. And the psychiatrist who was telling us the case history said, it was the lady who was able to change her perspective and say, when confronted with new evidence which contradicted her life scenario, "Oh, well, if you're Mary, then I must be St. Anne." She was the one who was able to adjust. So I hope that poor Matthew has now been able to readjust himself to a world that didn't end on the 19th of July in 1999. But that was the sort of the serious piece of the Nostradamus prophecies that we were busily filming down there. Most amazing fella, and of course it raises for me and for friends like yourselves who share my interest in unsolved mysteries, it raises the great question of if Nostradamus and Mother Shipton and the Brian Seer and the rest of these remarkable people who thought they could foresee the future, what were they really seeing? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they're not hoaxers, they're not shysters, they're not tricksters, they're not doing it for the money, they are seeing or hearing something a bit odd and then translating it in a way of their own. What are they seeing and hearing? Now, if the future, of course, is all cut and dried, as in the Terminator films or as in Back to the Future, and then we're faced with a quite amazing scenario. If a man from the future can come back and say hello to us, then does it mean that things are inevitable? And we're then into this sort of Calvinist philosophical theological problem. If everything is preordained, well then what's the point of me trying to be a nice guy? I might as well go out and be Jack the Ripper, or I'll go and hit the nearest branch of the bank and take out a couple of rolls of notes. In other words, what is the point of morality if everything is cut and dried anyway and we have no choice? Jack the Ripper had to be Jack the Ripper, and Mother Teresa had to be Mother Teresa, and Albert Schweitzer had to be Albert Schweitzer. And, you know, the Archbishop of Canterbury had to be who he is, and all sorts of other people have to be who and what they are, including the unspeakable Mr. West from Gloucester. Now, if things are foreordained, and you and I are just running along tram lines, well then life is utterly pointless. And as life has seemed to me for the last 60-odd years to have quite a lot of point and to be thoroughly enjoyable and worth living, I can't accept the idea that it's all cut and dried and there's no morality and there's no point in being ambitious, because if you are intended to be the 44th President of the United States of America, you will be. And if you're intended to be Osama bin Laden, you'll be that as well. So there's got to be far more to it than that. But if the future is not cut, dried, arranged, and in a sense existing already, what the dickens do Nostradamus and Mother Shipton and the Brian Seer, what is it that they're seeing and bringing back to the rest of us? Let's look at three possibilities. One is that wonderful science fiction concept of the probability track. Now, all kinds of things could have happened to all of us this morning on the way down to breakfast. I could have got my head stuck in the lift doors and been rushed off to hospital, and you'd have been spared this lecture. Or I could have suddenly got a telegram saying, you've just won a sort of 5 million lottery accumulator. I would then have come in, given you £1,000 each, and said, I'm sorry boys, I'm not doing the lecture this morning, we're going off to Hawaii on the next plane. But as compensation for not being here, have £1,000 each, and best of luck, hire another lecturer. And probably get Colin Wilson for that. Or Terry Pratchett. No. The thing, anything could have happened apart from those two ridiculous extremes. You can trip, you can choke on a cornflake, anything might have happened. And as a result of the might have beens, the worlds of if I was now in Plymouth Hospital having a cornflake extracted from my throat on breathing apparatus, something different would have happened here. Any one of you might have said, well, as there's no 10 o'clock lecture, let's go out and have a look at Plymouth, and then you might have seen or met or any one of a number of fabulous things might have happened because of the odd cornflake. And you know the tale of the horseshoe nail, where for the want of the nail the shoe was lost, for the want of the shoe the rider was lost, the rider was lost, the message was lost, the battle was lost, the kingdom was lost, all for the want of the horseshoe nail. Now, it is those little horseshoe nails that operate the wheels of if. So, let us imagine that our seer, our Nostradamus, has looked forward, not into a reality, or certainly not into an inevitable reality, but onto one of those great wheels of if that have turned in a different direction. You remember, and Dickens was a great thinker and philosopher, as well as a very entertaining writer. You remember, he says, Scrooge says, to the spirit of Christmas yet to be, when they visit the home of Bob Cratchit, and they see this lonely crutch in the corner, and Scrooge says with tears to the spirit of Christmas yet to be, well, must these things be? Is there nothing I can do? And he, the spirit, says, if nothing changes, there will be an empty chair in Cratchit's house. If nothing changes. Well, it did. And of course, Scrooge became a very philanthropic and loving and adoptive granddad to Tiny Tim, and they lived happily ever after. So, when you're looking at probability tracks of the future, you are listening, to some extent, to that spirit of Christmas yet to be in the Scroogian tradition, who was saying, if nothing changes, then A and B. Isn't it like the computer models that we make? When we're trying to see what will happen if, and we feed in the data, and we've compressed it into a simplified model to see what's going to happen either to the economy or to medical research or to whatever field we're working in, to see what will happen if certain factors are put in or certain factors are withdrawn. But we know, as modelers, that we've only created a hypothetical model. And this is what I suspect the natural-born seers are doing. Whether they are tapping into some sort of etheric knowledge that exceeds what we've got. And I love old Jung's theories about, you know, this group subconscious into which we're all feeding. It seems to me that the internet is an electronic version of what Jung was trying to tell us was not electronic, but was in some way mysterious and psychical. And the idea that we have there of something which is able to forecast more accurately than any individual can what may happen if, like Spirit of Christmas Yet to Be, saying if nothing changes, or like our computer models that say if nothing changes, then if seers are uncannily accurate sometimes, is that what they've done? Have they plumbed into the equivalent of an internet with a vast amount of knowledge that the individual networkers ain't got? Now, there is another fascinating and intriguing possibility here, that these mysterious worlds actually exist. And there are some of the physicists who would tell us that because I did not choke on my cornflakes this morning, and I'm actually here having the pleasure of being with a group of friends talking about strange things, that that world still exists, or the world in which something very, very good, that I put a different number on my lottery ticket from the one I usually put on, and the flipping thing won. So that these worlds, far from being daydreams, have, according to some avant-garde physicists, got a real existence. Those of you who are more knowledgeable than I am about which author wrote what story will recall I think it was Theodore Sturgeon, one of those beautifully funny science fiction stories in which a poor little chap who in our world was poor, miserable and henpecked was able to step into another world, another of these probability tracks, in which he was the emperor. And I'll tell you how long ago it was written, because for his birthday he called Bing Crosby and Bob Hope to come and entertain him at the party. He had that kind of power, and it was that kind of a date. So his alternative universe was existing, say, 30 years ago, when Theodore Sturgeon wrote the story. And the poor fella had got so acclimatized to the very dominant lady who made his life almost unbelievably miserable on Earth. She had trained him to come home for meals. And so from being the emperor and running a sort of star galaxy, he steps back, puts on his little cloth cap, and, I'm sorry I'm late, Martha, and steps back into a reality he didn't want. And it wasn't until a very wise member of his court said, "Sir, has it never occurred to you that you could eat here in your palace instead of going home for meals?" Because he never went back to Martha again. He simply stayed in the probability world where he was the emperor and where Bing Crosby and Bob Hope were honoured to come and entertain him on his birthday. Now, if the physicists are right, then on one of these possible worlds at its darkest and most miserable and most horrible, you and I are prisoners in a dungeon being starved and our only company is rats. And in another one, we are emperor of the universe and everything's going perfectly for us. The only thing is, if you step between one and the other, you've got to be very careful to step into the one where things are a bit better than the one here. It's a whole wide philosophical field into which I sometimes feel like a young rabbit, intellectually, who has just come out of his burrow and has seen this great field of speculation, and I'm wondering which blade of grass to nibble first. But it opens up whole new vistas of philosophy, and I said, I'm only about 18 inches from the burrow at the moment, and there's an awful lot more green grass out there philosophically to explore. So that is the possibility of the Nostradamus and the Mother Shipton stuff. They appear to have got hold of something, and often what they've got hold of is not completely correct and is very frequently open to all sorts of interpretations. Let's take the marvellous thing about the Delphic oracle, where the poor little priestess sat sucking up the fumes from the fire below her seat, and as she inhaled the fumes she got particularly woolly and she mumbled. And once she was mumbling nicely, one of the jolly old priests of Delphi would have a good listen, and then, being particularly politically acute and knowledgeable about what was likely to happen if, and being a past master of ambiguities, he would say to whichever king or general had come to ask his opinion, "This will happen." The most famous case being the ambiguity about poor old Crassus of Lydda, who came along and asked the Delphic oracle, "If I attack Persia, what will happen?" Well, he was a particularly generous sponsor of the temple of Apollo where the Delphic oracle was, so they didn't want to offend him. And having got the poor little priestess mumbling nicely, the priest said to King Crassus, "If you attack Persia, sire, a great empire will fall." And it did, it was his. When he was a prisoner in Persia awaiting execution or some fate worse than death, he said, "Never call a man happy until he's dead." But the wonderful ambiguity of, if you attack Persia, a great empire will fall here, no doubt. The priest didn't specify which one. And in some of the Nostradamus and Delphic prophecies, you do tend to get things of that kind, but it's, when you take Mother Shipton's wonderful thing, coaches without horses through mountains will travel. And we, with the hindsight of saying, oh yes, trains going through tunnels in mountains, wasn't she clever? But when you analyse what she said, carriages without horses through mountains shall travel, well, what is through? Does it mean that there's a whacking great gorge like the Grand Canyon? Are you simply riding up a different... What was she really seeing? And it's the knowledge afterwards. It's that beautiful hindsight. Nostradamus talked a great deal about Hister, H-I-S-T-E-R. Never once in all his books of prophecies did he ever mention Hitler with a T on its own. It was always Hister. And Hister was simply the old name for the river Danube. But of course, after Adolf had arisen and caused all his troubles, everybody said, "Core, Nostradamus prophesied that." Well, did he? Then there were arguments that he was clairaudient, and that he had misheard the name Hister and Hitler on some future radio broadcast that he picked up from either, the atrocious Lord Haw-Haw, who used to do the, Joyce, who used to do those pro-Nazi broadcasts. I'm dating myself crinkly with this, aren't I? This was all World War II. There are others suspected before even the oldest friends in this audience were hatched. But never mind. So, let's go from that prophecy thing. I want to say a little bit more about the mysteries and strange things of Rennes-le-Château, but I want to do this via a detour where Trish and I were on our way down to Rennes for our first visit there in 1975. And we thought, well, if we go through Vichy, we shall also be able to visit Glozel, which was the mystery of the indecipherable clay tablets of Glozel near Vichy. Now, what had happened was this, and this was just before my time. In 1924, there was a young French farm boy called Émile Fradin. And Émile's granddad, who owned the farm at the time, called him in and said, "Émile, please will you come and help me? One of the cows has fallen into a hole." So young Émile, being both courageous and agile with his 14 years, took a large roll of webbing that Grandad had provided and went down into a hole that was about the same depth as this false ceiling here, just above, so it would be about 7 feet, 8 feet deep. And it was roughly from where I'm standing now, then if I said, went to that pillar, and about that far this way, so we're looking at a hole which is roughly 10 foot by 4, 8 foot, 9 foot by 4, and about that depth. And being a good and humane boy, he managed to pacify the terrified cow, and he got the webbing underneath her, and he got some burly friends of Grandad on the other side. And you could imagine these brawny as it might be, say 4 or 5 of the brawny lads here, and 4 or 5 of us on the other side, and we all pull gently in opposite directions, and poor old Claribel comes up to the top. And none the worse for her fright, apparently. A couple of days later, she was back supplying the Fradins with milk for their customers as though nothing had happened. So the animal lover half of that story appeals to me because it has a happy ending for Claribel. But the boy, young Émile, shouted up to Grandad, who was very pleased with him, "Can I have the morning off, Grandad? And I found some strange things down here." Now the inside of the hole which the boy had descended into to rescue Claribel was glazed, as we described it afterwards, a sort of vitreous surface. And this is where those in the von Daniken discipleship group were quite convinced that it had been made originally by an alien spacecraft taking off and vitrifying the stone and soil with the heat of the exhaust. A rather more probable explanation is that it had been a medieval glass kiln where high temperatures had been produced in order to make the rather simple glass of the 16th and 17th centuries. Anyway, for whatever reason, the inside of the hole in the field was vitrified. And there were little niches and shelves and quite deliberate storage places cut out of the sides of it. And in them there were carved antlers, carved bones, flint arrowheads, flint axes. There were little figurines of the goddess, and there were a number, and here the controversy really focus, there were a number of amazing clay tablets, about the same size that you could press out from wet clay between your two hands. Some a little bit bigger, but they could quite easily have been made by taking wet clay, pressing it, letting it dry a little, and then inscribing it. Now the alphabet on there, some of it looked almost runic, some of it looked like Ogham, some of it looked Coptic, some of it looked Syro-Phoenician. It could have been anything, and it has never yet been deciphered. All sorts of wonderful guesses. You know the Easter Island tale about the Rongo script, which some dear old Catholic missionary priest got over there, but he found on Easter Island, you know where the big stone faces are, there were some wooden tablets which were known as Rongo. And if you asked one of the Easter Islanders, who were the indigenous inhabitants when all this was going on a couple of hundred years ago, when they were first discovered, they would say, the tablets are here but not here, which meant that they were hidden somewhere. Whether they still exist, nobody knows. They were faithfully copied, and as I said, nobody has ever cracked this Rongo script on the Easter Island tablets. Although, as I said, this very confident missionary decided that he got a system of, he just made it up as he went along, because none of it was consistent. What he said was a word on one tablet wasn't the same word on another one. But I think he may, like John Spencer and Company, have been eager to sell books. The original badges. Rongo badger script, fly here, get your free copy. So there have been over the centuries, and there certainly was on Easter Island, this amazing script which only added to the mystery of the big stone faces. Now, we got all this basic knowledge from our research about Glozel, and as we were going all the way down to see the Rennes-le-Château mystery, we decided we'd stop off at Glozel and see if the little museum was still open, displaying the tablets. Now, there had been, in 1924, one of the most bitter, vitriolic rows in the whole history of French academia. See, the Fradin boys called in, the farmers called in a friend of theirs called Dr. Morlaix. Dr. Morlaix was a medic who was an amateur archaeologist. A good one, but an amateur. And he looked at these tablets and said, basically, oh, sacre bleu, qu'est-ce que ça? And he rushes off to Paris and informs Professor Capitan, who was head of the Archaeological Institute, and a very, very learned and eminent man. Capitan came down, and Capitan went into orbit, looked wonderful. Looked at the tablets, said to Dr. Morlaix and the Fradins, you have made what is possibly the most important archaeological discovery in France in the 20th century. This proves that there were ancient civilizations and cultures visiting France. It gives us a world position. He was absolutely, you know, rather like the Walt Disney pair of lovebirds. He was up in the air with little hearts going around his head and twittering. And he said to Dr. Morlaix, in the way that high-ranking academicians do, oh, Dr. Morlaix, I'm very busy at the moment, but if you have a little time on your hands, I would be most grateful. Would you write a full report and catalogue the items for me, and then send your report to Paris, and I'll see that it's disseminated? We translate that as, you do the work, my name goes on the paper. And Morlaix said, damn it, if I do the work, my name goes on the paper. So he wrote up a very full and very accurate and good scientific report on the Fradin discoveries, and he signed it, Dr. Morlaix, and it was published, Dr. Morlaix. And then Capitan blew his little steamy top. He came racing back to Rennes-le-Château, to Glozel, and having, within the month, said that it was the most exciting discovery that France had ever seen archaeologically. It's all rubbish. Morlaix's an idiot to be taken in by it. The Fradins are criminals and tricksters and hoaxsters, and they made it all and put it down there just to gain publicity and bring people to their museum. End of story. And Morlaix said, no, it's not. And this battle raged right through World War II, with the French archaeological establishment on one side and the Fradin family and Dr. Morlaix on the other, until nature took its course and all the original combatants went to a place where archaeological disputes have permanently settled. Of course, you can actually meet the people who did them. And so, when we went there in 1975, we went up to it, then simmered down quite a lot. We then went to the taxi rank by the station and asked taxi drivers in their 20s and 30s who were queuing up, connaissez-vous le petite ville du Glozel, monsieur? Ah bon, ici, ici. Il dit Glozel. Connaissez-vous? No, pas le Glozel. Pas ici. We got about 6 of these guys all getting very worked up because we were asking them for a place they'd never heard of. And it was only 3 miles outside Vichy. But none of the Vichy taxi drivers knew of Glozel. And we didn't know what to do. And then an old taxi driver saunters across from the bistro with his cognac still in one hand, curious as to what this idiot Englishman was doing to upset the young taxi drivers. And he said, Monsieur? So I tried again with my pidgin French. Connaissez-vous le petit ville du Glozel? Oh, Glozel, vite avec moi! He grabs us one in each hand and races off to his taxi before any of the other guys could get an all-day order. There was more than the rest of them were going to earn in the week. He bundled us into the taxi, drives off, and we met at Glozel by a nice guy, farmer, overalls, pitchfork in one hand pretty well. Monsieur? I said, well, you know, we have come from England and we would very much like to see the museum. Is it still here? He says, oh yes. And then he said, moi, je suis Émile Fradin, je découvre les tablettes. And I thought, wow, this is the guy who at 14 years old in 1924 went down the hole, rescued Clarabelle and brought back the tablets. And then we had our second stroke of luck. Glyn Daniel was then a very well-known historical archaeological broadcaster. And he, among the other programs he did, had gone over to Glozel to examine the tablets. Now, his other great attribute was that he was a wine connoisseur, and a real one, and he had a very valuable and closely protected palate. Monsieur Fradin, like many French farmers of the Midi, used to brew a very powerful, semi-toxic homemade wine. And so did my grandmother. You will see the connection momentarily. My grandma was a blacksmith's daughter from rural Norfolk, and you either made homemade plonk or you didn't have a drink. And grandmother used to make incredibly strong homemade plonk, and from things like dandelions and elderflowers and all the, you know, the homemade wine experts among you will know how it's done. You'll also know how potent it can get if it's done right and stored. And because my mother worked in Dad's shop, a little corner shop, Grandma was largely responsible for looking after the infant Lionel, and when it made too much noise and wouldn't go to sleep, I gathered afterwards she'd give me a glass of her homemade blonde. We had a very pleasant sentiment. Could account for things that have happened to me later in life. This is the Glyn Daniel bit, which was the second half of my stroke of luck, which endeared us to Émile Fradin. Is it Connaissez-vous Daniel? I said, yes, he's quite a famous broadcaster. Ah, he's horrible. He's a very rude man. And because he had to protect his refined palate, when Emile Fradin offered Glendaniel a glass of his plonk, he politely took a tiny sip and went, "Ugh!" and got rid of it, quick. Now, the result was that Emile was mortally offended because to a French winemaker, your special brew is rather like your baby. And it was as if a politician had picked the baby up to kiss it and then chucked it back in the frat. So it was a horrible baby. And so the basic reaction was that Emile Fradin had acquired a distinct loathing of poor Glendaniel. He was only protecting his palate. Whereas I was like a long-lost brother because I was drinking this stuff as if it was hot, sweet tea. And we got on like the proverbial house on fire. He took us to see the hole in the field where he had rescued the cow and showed us all the exhibits. And the thing that came out as clearly as could be was that Emile Fradin was a totally honest, simple French farmer. No more capable of morally hoaxing people with phony tablets than he was of making the darn things, because they did look quite impressive. And so when we came to write it up in various books and to lecture about him and do broadcast on him, Unsolved Mystery shows, I said, the guy is genuine. I don't know what these tablets are, and I certainly can't read them. But it is not something that Emile Fradin made in 1924. I can't solve the mystery, but I'll say there is a mystery. Well then, as you will recall, not many years ago, in the University of Copenhagen, University of Edinburgh, simultaneous networking between the universities, they discovered a wonderful new dating technique for clay artifacts and for pottery, called thermoluminescence, and all you do basically is put a sample in a sealed container, you heat it, there's a light receptor at the top, and at the temperature at which it glows gives you the so-called thermoluminescent glow curve. You get a kind of hiccup in the graph as it goes up. Well, if it's something that we broke at breakfast this morning, if you dropped a cup or saucer and it's a very recent piece of pottery, then you'd have to take it all the way up here to high temperature before you get the glow curve hiccup in your graph. If, on the other hand, it was a piece of Roman pottery or Beaker people pottery from way back, you'd only have to take it up to a couple of 100 degrees and you get your glow curve hiccup on the graph almost immediately. Well, of course, one of the first things that we needed to test, that anybody wanted to test, was the mystery of the Glozel tablets. And there was a time period of some 2,500 years, all the bits and pieces down in that hole in the ground. The oldest was nearly 3,000 years old, and the youngest was well over 500. There was no way that anything down there had been manufactured by Emile Fradin and his granddad in 1924. So you've got real old stuff. But why such a huge range from almost Neolithic right through Bronze Age up to medieval France, 1400, 1500? No, it was it. Well, I have a theory. Can't prove it. I'll offer it to you and, welcome your comments. The show called Cat Weasel a few years ago, medieval wizard who got into our century and had all sorts of problems. Now, Cat Weasel collected all sorts of charms and talismans and lucky this and that, and you could imagine the life of a 14th, 15th, 16th century wizard, in inverted commas, or wise woman, we don't know the gender, but somebody who didn't know anything that we know of Neolithic, Bronze Age and real archaeological history, found these odd things, little flint arrowheads. Oh, this is an elven arrow. This is an elven hand axe. This is some strange magical thing. It may have been used by a demon who could cut the stone with his claws. And all sorts of weird explanations for archaeological miscellanea. And so as the wizard goes his way, he collects these things. He finds a deserted glass kiln, which is ideal for his purposes, and he puts these little bits in until needed. And then somebody comes along and says, I love that beautiful milkmaid, but she's ignoring me. Could you give me a love charm? Oh yes, I'll give you a great one here. 2 pieces of wet clay, slaps his hand together, draws a couple of hearts, and Fred loves Ethel. And because the person he makes it for cannot read at all, the purchaser of the love charm has no idea what the wizard's written on here, and probably neither has the wizard. He's just making odd marks to impress the customer. And into the little, oh, well, that'll be 2 gold francs, please. He then goes round and says to the said beautiful milkmaid, that young man over there is very rich and he's crazy about you. If I were you, I'd just get in his, just get into his orbit. And shortly afterwards, they get married and live happily ever after. And the young man rushes back to the wizard and says, thank you so much for that wonderful love charm. Then you've got a guy like me who's going off to be a mercenary somewhere, go up to the wizard, because I've had a couple of narrow squeaks in previous battles. He'll go to the wizard and say, have you got anything that'll stop me getting killed in the next battle? Because I don't like our chances very much. 2 gold francs, soldier, and I'll sell you an elven arrowhead. As long as you wear this under your armour, no arrow will pierce it. I get killed in the 2nd day of battle. Who goes back to complain? So our wizard friend also has to keep careful watch on the Inquisition, because if he's discovered, then there is no magic charm or filter or potion or talisman that will save him from 2 days of unspeakable agony followed by a nice hot bath without the water. Just one of the omissions. I'm sorry, we haven't got the water, but just take the steak and light the fire. So the wizard has to be very, very careful. And so he pulls branches and turf over the top of his secret wizard warehouse, and then one day the poor blighter is caught. And nature takes its course, and the grass and the turf and the branches he's put there, the hole is still there, but there's quite a sturdy natural cover has grown over the top. And if a cow places just one of her hooves on it, no harm, just goes down a little bit and she goes on her way grazing. But if the unfortunate Clarabelle walks straight into it with all 4 hooves, wham! And in comes Emil Fradan, gets her safely out again, and they all live happily ever after, with the 50 years of controversy before the universities of Edinburgh and Copenhagen sorted it all out for them. So that was one of the things we found on the way down to Rennes-le-Château. Rennes-le-Château I did mention briefly last night for those brave and courageous souls who endured the ghost stories to the bitter end. And we mentioned, again in passing, it came up in the quiz, about what was really buried at Rennes-le-Château. I'd like to add a couple of quick ones. You all know the basic story. 1885, the impoverished Béranger Saunière, priest of Rennes-le-Château, suddenly becomes richest man in the south of France, and nobody knows to this day what the dickens he found or how he became rich. Whether he found a means of making money, whether he found Cathar treasure, which had been buried after the Cathars were massacred in 1244 at Montségur, whether he found the hidden Templar treasure, which had been up at Chateau Blanchefort, and there had been a warning given to the Blanchefort Templars that Philip's men, Philip IV, Philip the Bel, was coming to attack all the Templars, so they managed to transfer their treasure down to the church, bury it under the church at Rennes. There's also the ancient manuscript theory, which suggests that the treasure is buried with the body of Dagobert II, who was of the Merovingian Visigothic dynasties. All kinds of tales as to what Saunière found. And I don't know which one is true. I do know that certain things are sort of total rubbish, although there have been various interesting supportive documents put forward. We met a remarkable guy who is the present owner of the Chateau Haute-Poule, which is in the middle of the village. And I don't know how anyone quite manages to do this, but if you can think of any ruined castle that you've visited with your heritage card, and then imagine that there are 2 habitable rooms in this ruin, and that when you want to, this guy lives there with his sister, and she will go into the kitchen and cook, and then she will walk across through this ruined courtyard with crumbling towers leaning over like the one at Pisa, into the other habitable room where they will eat their meal, and then come rain or shine, the washing up goes back across this empty courtyard to the habitable kitchen. And they're very hospitable, lovely people. We spent several hours with them, and he showed me all the collection of stuff that he's got there. But down under the ruined Chateau Haute-Poule, which is adjacent to Sauniere's church, those friends here who've been to Rennes will know exactly how they're situated. In the ruined Chateau Haute-Poule, there appears to be a filled-in dungeon in one corner. And I would, again, if we ever had the good luck to pull a few billion on the lottery, I would very much like to buy that ruin and dig under that dungeon to see what's down there. There would at least be a book and a film to recoup the expenses, but there might also be something absolutely priceless. So the other strange tale that we found intriguing at Rennes was the story which the old inhabitants tell that their grandparents told to them about Sauniere's very mysterious death. He was apparently placed in state in a chair and covered in a robe that had tassels all over it, rather like the sort of Georgian tablecloths, you know, drapery of that kind. And all the villagers lined up and plucked a tassel from the dead Sauniere's robe and took it with them as a memento. Now, one of the strange symbols that go through, that percolate through the Rennes mystery, is the very strange symbol of the bee. It had all kinds of associations with the ancient French kings, and more than one French king's tomb has been opened to reveal golden bees along with the king's body. Now, was this robe the best they could do for Saunière in the circumstances at the time? Were they saying these are indications that Berenger Saunière was more than their parish priest? Did he and they believe that he was an illegitimate descendant of the lost Merovingian kings? It seems to have been the case, because nobody resented his wealth, and the villagers whom he had, or who had helped him when he was very poor, and when he first arrived there, he had a salary of 50 pence a month. Well, even in 1885, you're not going to get very fat on 50 pence a month. 12.5 pence a week. And so what poor old Saunière did was to go round to the parishioners who were as poor as he was and say, "Monsieur, might I have breakfast with you tomorrow? Madame, could I come for lunch the day after? Any chance of a little cheese supper on Friday?" And by eking it out and going all round the village, he didn't impose on his impoverished friends, but when he found whatever he did find, they were invited back, and the guy who'd given him a glass of goat's milk and a piece of bread and cheese found himself sitting down to a 5-course luxury meal with wine between every course. Saunière also spent money like water on the village. There is no doubt at all about the man's conspicuous consumption. He spent money like water on literally a water tower, he paved 3 miles of road. If you've had a small piece of tarmac from the path to your garage done, you can imagine from experience what it would cost to have 3 miles of dirt road tarmacked and properly surfaced. Saunière paid for all that. And he built himself a luxury villa, the Villa Bethania, and he also built orangeries, walkways, and the famous Folly Tower, which appears inevitably in every book about Rennes-le-Château. And that tower is curious because it commands a view of the central place, the meeting place, not quite a market, but something like that, the central square of the village of Cuisa, on the next hill where Saunière was born. And we feel that it's likely that his parents held some sort of dynastic secret that had been whispered to one or other of them, saying, we're only peasants now, but great, what's it, was actually the mother of an illegitimate child by Dagobert II or Sigebert IV, or one of the last of that Merovingian group. And so they were clinging on to these Merovingian genes, however small and diluted they then become. And they told Saunière, you are rightfully the lord of this place. You should be the Grand Master of Rennes-le-Château. There's a treasure there, boy, if only you can find it. And so, inspired by this, Saunière, who was not a particularly spiritual man, not a bad guy, but not one of the villains by any means, but not deep and meditative and contemplative and scholarly and priestly. And I think he endured 7 years in a Jesuit seminary in order to get ordained, in order to apply for the village of Rennes-le-Château that nobody else wanted because of this rotten stipend. So he was one in a field of one, and they said, you want to be priest at Rennes? Come, lad, it's all yours. Nobody else wants it. Rather like being awarded, you know, if you're Siamese, rather like being awarded a white elephant. We wish to honour you by giving you this white elephant, which will now cost you more than you can afford to keep for the rest of your life. The polite way of getting rid of somebody who gave him the order of the white elephant. So they were giving Saunière the order of the white elephant parish of Rennes-le-Château. And he then had the ultimate vantage point for finding whatever was hidden there. And as I said, one of the theories that we saw this secret panel, I actually had my hand on the panel where this mysterious little glass vial was found with a twist of parchment inside by the grandfather of the guy that we knew. He'd given it to Saunière. Saunière had looked at it. Oh, get about your business. And shortly afterwards had been the richest man in the south of France. And that, as I suspect, may have been a plan of the graves, as I was saying earlier. That led him to where the treasures were hidden. The other thing that we found most mystifying, sinister and odd about the Saunière story was that when an earnest young priest called Rivière was brought in 1917 to take poor old Saunière's deathbed confession, he heard the first few words of it, ran for his life, and left Saunière dying unabsolved. Now, as an ordinary run-of-the-mill Anglican, I don't often get asked to hear confessions. I do sometimes. There are some high church Anglicans who like to follow the Catholic tradition, confessing to their priests. I've heard some strange things, especially from people who felt they were nearing the ends of their lives. But I have never, ever heard anything that would have made me run from the room and say, no, I can't absolve you. Guy is genuinely penitent. He could be Jack the Ripper if he's about to die, and I'd still absolve him. But if there is genuine penitence. Now, what on earth did Saunière say to young Father Rivière that not only sent him running from the room, but gave the poor guy a nervous breakdown? He couldn't work for 3 months. The bishop gave him 3 months off. Had Saunière murdered, you know, part of the Rennes mystery was the mysterious death of poor old Antoine Gélis, who was the priest at Custoza, the next village.
And Antoine Gélis was found horribly butchered with an axe. And whoever had done it had then gone to the trouble of laying him out with his hands folded across his chest, as a priest or a funeral director or a medic would do when preparing a body to, show the next of kin when they arrive. Gélis had been terrified of something. The only person allowed into his presbytery was his niece. She was there every day with clean clothes and food. She took away the old cups, plates and whatnots, and the dirty clothes to be washed. And Gélis insisted that she must wait upon the doorstep until she had heard him slam home the bolts on the presbytery door. And we ask ourselves, why? Okay, he may just have been unduly nervous, but I think he had something to be nervous about. The fact that he was found horrendously dead not long afterwards indicates that his fears were not ill-founded. Now, our suspicion is that Saunière, who was not a scholar, had gone in there with some of these manuscripts in Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and he couldn't decode them. And old Gélis was a bright boy and an academic, and he said, "Leave them with me, Béranger." And then when Béranger came back for them, he said, "This is very important. I want my share, or I will talk." And Saunière, who was a man of quick temper, said, "No, you won't." Bang. And the first blow was struck with the firearms. Gélis had then, from reconstructing what had happened, run for the window to try and scream for help. And it was then that he'd been finished off with an axe and laid out reverently. Unsolved mystery. 1890, thereabouts. Who killed the priest of Custoza in a house that was carefully locked and bolted? Wow. The young Father Rivière comes to the dying Saunière. "Have you anything to confess, my son?" "Yes, about 12 years ago I murdered Father Gélis with an axe." And this sensitive young priest then says, "This man has been celebrating the Mass every Sunday for 12 years with hands that butchered a fellow priest." Ugh. And in his state of nervous breakdown, poor Rivière runs. Another possibility is, we were talking about Rennes to a friend of ours who was deeply into white magic and allegedly knew all sorts of things about whatever white magic is. She had another friend who was even deeper into the magical morass and knew what there was to be known. And she said, "I will go and ask my Ipsissimus," who I gather is fairly highly placed in the magical hierarchy, came back bubbling with excitement and said, "I know what Saunière was doing. He was performing a spell to do the transition of Venus, and he was performing this spell which would give you accurate prophecies. People were coming to him to buy prophecy." We're back to Nostradamus, aren't we? And so while they were doing this convocation of Venus spell, because Venus, as well as being the very bright planet, was also the old classical love goddess of mythology, it was necessary to have a nubile young lady to assist you with the ceremonies, the sex magic, and it was done preferably to make it most effective on the altar. So Saunière says to the shockable young Rivière, "Oh, and apart from murdering Father Gélis, Marie Denarneau and I used to perform regular sex magic on the altar." Rivière goes, "Ah!" And sort of you get the altar cleaned up afterwards, and then who's coming to Mass? This is the same guy. And Rivière would have found this incredibly hard to take. Another thing that Saunière might have confessed to was that when the lawn outside the presbytery was excavated a few years ago, they found 3 bodies, young men, all shot. And theory here is that there was a link between Béranger Saunière and the royal house of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs, and that when Saunière found whatever he found, You couldn't take it back and sell it to the Vatican. I mean, it's like working for Samuels the jewellers, finding a diamond ring on the floor, and going up to your manager and saying, would you like to buy a diamond ring, Gov? And it's his anyway. So he couldn't take whatever he got, if it was some ancient religious artifact, with or without jewel encrustations. And he couldn't go to the Vatican and say, Holy Father, would you like to buy this priceless relic? Because he would say, of course not, it's ours anyway, boy, you're an employee. So, who could he sell it to? The Holy Roman Emperor. Only there wasn't one. But the Habsburgs used to be Holy Roman Emperors. Can you imagine him tapping at the door of the Habsburg palace and saying, could I speak to somebody on a rather delicate and important matter which would be of great value and interest to your noble house? And old Franz Joseph, who kept his fingers well away from anything even remotely tainted with impropriety, sends Rudolf and Johann, who were the two young Habsburg princes, go and see what that French priest wants. If it's anything important, come and tell me privately. I can't have anything to do with it myself. And they tell him. So Saunière then passes over whatever this priceless relic is and draws money from the Royal Bank of Austria, more or less in perpetuity. Now, as we all know, what happened to those two young Habsburg princes? Well, poor old Rudolf copped his lot up in the hunting lodge at Mayerling. You remember the famous Mayerling murders. The story was first given out, oh, the prince has been killed in a hunting accident. And then one of the cleaning ladies from the hunting lodge was sent on her way back to the village, past a well-lit, uncurtained window of a bedroom. And on the bed lay the naked body of Rudolf, the naked body of his 17-year-old mistress Maria Vetsera, and her head was pretty well blown off. Rudolf had a gun in his hand, and there wasn't too much left of his head either. So you've got the story, the lady, well, can you imagine, if I was the old cleaning lady, I'm back to the village, you know what they said about that hunting accident? That wasn't right at all. I looked through the window, and there they were, naked on the bed. Oh, it was dreadful. I must go and tell Mrs. Brown. So within 30 seconds, it's all round the village of Mayerling that it wasn't a hunting accident. The prince and his girlfriend have committed suicide. Oh, dreadful, shock, awful. That story would spread through the whole of Austria like wildfire, which was exactly what the secret police wanted. Because if they'd given out that it was a lover's suicide, those of us who were shrewd and politically knowledgeable would have said, no way. Somebody got him, and it was Maria's bad luck to be with him when they decided to put him away. So you give out story A, you then expose story B, and it's only when nasty, suspicious people like us come along that we say, wait a minute, they did that deliberately. Now, there was a man, again, Johann, who was a close friend of Rudolph's. They were the two who would have dealt with Saunière on behalf of Franz Joseph, if anybody did. And he suddenly gives up all claim to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He takes the name of Jonathan Ort. He does an intensive course in navigation. He gets his master's ticket. He buys a ship called the Lady Margaret. He takes his girlfriend with him and sails off to South America, where apparently the Lady Margaret sank in a storm. Now, I think that Johann had the good sense to get away from the Habsburg terrorist organisation and secret police, to take his lady with him and to get his crew, his loyal crew, to ditch him, dump him somewhere safe on the coast, get off themselves, take whatever financial reward he'd given them, and then send the ship out with the stopcocks open, and down went the Lady Margaret somewhere, never recovered, never seen again. Now that would be a more interesting wreck than the Titanic, if only we could bring that one up. It really would solve some mysteries. So the two young Habsburgs who were allegedly involved with Berenger Saunière, one's vanished, one's dead. Who is this sinister man at the back of the Austro-Hungarian secret police? He's a villainous object called Count Taff. And I suspect that the 3 dead bodies in Sauniere's lawn at Rennes-le-Château near the presbytery were 3 rather foolish Austrian Secret Service agents who gravely underestimated their target. They had got it in their heads that this is a rather simple French village priest that they're going to kill. The man's a soft target. Hardly need send 3 of us. Fred could do that on his own with a garrote. Hardly need to take your guns with you, boys. Dead easy one. They are dealing with one of the most dangerous and ruthless men in France. A man who spent 7 years in misery in order to get ordained, in order to get the church. A man who, when threatened with blackmail by the, I want my cut from old Jalis, said, you'll get a cut, mate, you'll get it in the back of your head with an axe. So here's a man who was quite capable of killing, quite capable of achieving his objective at any cost, and not a soft target. Now, imagine the scene. It is moonlight. There are 3 sinister men, guns drawn, crossing the presbytery lawn. Saunière takes his arm out from under the nubile and beautiful Marie. Excuse me, ma chérie, I have business. Get us a spade, Marie. And Saunière and Marie put these 3 toads down in the lawn, where they remained until excavations unearthed them many years later. I said they had very gravely underestimated their man. It was almost like sending 3 innocent young agents to stop James Bond. It was that kind of odds. And at any rate, that is one of the theories about the bodies in the lawn. We're back to young Father Riviere, and Berger said, oh, by the way, I murdered old Father Jalis because he wanted a cut of my treasure and said he'd tell everybody if I didn't give him one. I've also been having hijinks on the altar with Marie because we needed to in order to, work the spell of the convocation of Venus. Oh, and there were those 3 guys I shot and buried in the presbytery lawn. But other than that, I've lived a blameless life. And so we can, I think, perhaps now begin to understand why poor young Father Riviere, not long out of the seminary, was beginning to have qualms and doubts about whether this dangerous old man ought to be absolved or not. It's rather like the bumper sticker, I can imagine it going through his mind. One of the American Royal Marines had a bumper sticker that read, "It is God's task to judge Bin Laden. It's my job to arrange the meeting." Anyway, so the mystery of Rennes-le-Château is by no means a swift and straightforward one. There are all kinds of strange things. And so when we were with the old couple who ran the ruined chateau, the brother had a wonderful book, an illustration from which is in ours, he said unashamedly, and with his permission we photographed one of the pages. He'd spent with his father many years in compiling this book on the history of Rennes-le-Château. His theory was, and this is what steered a lot of other theories in what we think was probably the wrong direction, he said the whole village had been deliberately laid out in the form of a ship of the dead to indicate that some great leader was buried there. And from this came all the suggestions that the real secret of Rennes was that Saunière had discovered proof that the body of Jesus was buried there. Now, if that theory followed, then Saunière's money came simply from this. You toddle off to the Vatican and you say, oh, by the way, I've discovered that Christianity is complete rubbish and Jesus, who was supposed to have been resurrected, is actually dead in a cave in my village and I can take you there. And so the Pope says, all right, Saunière, what's your price? And he said, well, I'll have 5 million to start with and you can pay me another $1 million a year. Now, in the first place, whatever its sins and faults may be, I'm quite convinced that there are good and honest men in the Vatican who would have had nothing whatever to do with that sort of rubbish, but would have said, right, you show us what you think is your evidence, and we will have it properly and forensically examined, and we'll see what it is. And I could say after 30 years of close research into the Rennes-le-Château mystery that whatever else the mystery consists of, Saunière's wealth did not come from blackmailing the Vatican because he thought he'd found the body of Jesus. It isn't there. There is infinitely more evidence for the resurrection and ascension than there is for being smuggled out to the south of France, quietly buried in a hole under. And remember that rather weak study of the mystery called The Tomb of God by Andrews Schellenberg. And these two poor guys, they were given, he said jealously, a £200,000 advance to go out and we pay our own way when we go and investigate and sell the manuscript afterwards. But these guys were given a massive advance to write this Tomb of God, and the only real conclusion they reached was, we think he's in a cave in there and we can't get in because even with 200 grand to spend, we cannot get the rubble out of the cave. Now, if I had really believed that there was something in that cave, I'd have had it out there for 50 grand, never mind 200. So, there is the Rennes mystery, and still unsolved. The time is still with us, you lucky people. I think I was down for, am I down for an hour and a half, boss?
Yes.
Right, fine, you've got 20 minutes to go. Courage, my brave men. The bar is in sight. Now, another one I forgot to tell you about was the, last night I did the mystery of the Crogling Grange vampire, and I think we pretty well drained the dregs of him, but I would love to tell you about the Oak Island Money Pit in order, because it ties in with Rennes. And there is a possibility that if the treasure of Rennes was anything to do with the Templars, then the Templar fleet never fell into the hands of Philip le Bel and his henchmen. The Templar fleet got away. And because one of the Templar ensigns was a skull with crossed leg bones, and if you and I were Templars in the Holy Land and one of our good buddies had just stopped a Saracen arrow, having taken his armour off to give to the next qualified apprentice, then we would bury him as best we could, and if we were going to take any of him back to England, we would only take his head and his thigh bones. And so a Templar burial was crossed thigh bones, the sign of the Templar cross, with a head on the top. Now the Templar fleet may have been partly responsible for the famous Jolly Roger, and the original skull and crossbones may not have meant, hey guys, we're pirates. It may have meant, hey guys, if you're Saracens, look out, we're Templars. And so the ruthless bloodthirstiness of the legendary pirates may well have come from the ruthless bloodthirstiness of Templar soldiers at sea, who, if they came across one of the Barbary coast pirate vessels taking slaves from ships they'd attacked to be sold in North Africa, and a Templar ship had come across to do a rescue act, the Barbary coast lot would have received little mercy, and very short shift the slaves would have been liberated. So that the idea of ruthlessness, Jolly Roger, skull and crossbones, may simply have been guys like Ned Teach and Blackbeard and the rest of the gang, Henry Morgan, but it could also have been rooted in this Templar burial practice, and the two were conflated. In any way, Philip le Bel, 1307, makes a mess of 90% of the Templars, but he doesn't get the odd 10%, and the odd 10% included the Templar fleet. Now, if we were surviving Templars, and we did not particularly want whatever treasure we had acquired to fall into the hands of this very unpleasant French king, if ever a man was called Le Bel and didn't deserve it, it was Philip. Now, the French fleet, the Templar fleet, have had a lot of communication, not all of it unfriendly, with some of the Arabian sailors who were, and here we embarked quite recently on some research that was new to us, which indicated, when you look into the history of some of the early Muslim voyages, when Granada was all in the hands of the Moors and the Muslim Kingdom of Spain, that they had made trips to through what they described as the ocean of fog and ice, or the ocean of rain and ice, by which they meant the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And they got there a long time before Columbus, and even a long time before the famous voyage that the Sinclairs made from Orkney with the help of the Zeno brothers of Venice. And so what you have is a Templar fleet looking for somewhere to go, which has received information from Arabian sailors that there is a somewhere, and they've heard tales that some of their ancestors, as early as 1095, had crossed this sea of fog and rain and ice, and were over there, and had come back and had traded with people from, quote, from the Muslim account, a very strange land. Now, the Templar fleet, we suspect, made its way as far as it could to avoid Philip le Bel and his henchmen, taking with them a great deal of Templar treasure, including perhaps some priceless holy relics that they had acquired. You remember how the 9 Templars, the first Templars, when they went out there in 1118, they were digging, ostensibly of course they were there to protect the pilgrims, but they were digging below the Dome of the Rock, which before it became a great mosque had been part of Solomon's domain, and if there was anything exciting down under there, it was Solomonic or even pre-Solomonic. And these 9 Templars, who had been sent by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was an exceptionally powerful and able church politician, he was their sponsor. What had he sent them to find? Anyway, so let's keep on the back burner the idea that the Templars had got some sort of priceless holy relic after digging under the Dome of the Rock. That they were determined would at no cost, whatever it cost, would never fall into the hands of Philip le Bel. Far better to take it across the sea and drown on the way than that Philip should have it. What if they came to Oak Island? And there, because as well as their military skills, they were great architects. You look at all the Templar churches, Templar Church in London, you look at all the Templar castles and commanderies and fortresses, their military architecture was brilliant. It matched their courage. So here are men with architectural knowledge, men with great determination, men with a treasure that they're going to keep away from Philip le Bel at all costs, and men with the knowledge they've gained from Arabian friends that there is another land out there if only you've got the courage to cross this great sea of ice and fog and rain. And they turn up at Nova Scotia. Now, we jump from there to the lads who discovered the money pit in the year 1795. Imagine, if you will, you are a teenager in Nova Scotia at the end of the 18th century. Your job prospects are threefold. You can be a fisherman, you can be a timberman, or you can be a farmer, all of which require working hard and in dangerous areas from dawn till dusk. And the thought that you might get something better out of life inspires you to carry on. Their parents, the parents of the 3 boys concerned, were nice folks. They said, look son, we can't get a day off, but it's not quite so bad today. You 3 kids go and have a day out. Take the boat, go off. Just have one day, even if we can't. So the 3 happy young teenagers go off and take their boat to Oak Island. It's not very far out, a few hundred yards out, but it's a mile or so long, half a mile wide, uninhabited. Isn't this a little bit like 5 go off to Smuggler's Top in like the kind of thing that I thoroughly enjoyed as a teenager? I would have loved to be one of the 3 kids in the boat rowing out to Oak Island. It's that kind of healthy, happy teenage adventure story. They get there, and as they're exploring the island, and I'm going to use this little bit of dance floor as the as a visual aid, they came across a clearing, and there was a depression around about that size. It was about 13 feet across, where the earth evidently sunk. Above it, say here, is the branch of an oak tree which has been lopped off short. Dangling from the branch is an old ship's block and tackle which has been there a long, long time because the weather's got to it. And we're three teenage kids, we want to escape from the drudgery and hardship of life in Nova Scotia 200 years ago. We see that, and we shout, "Pirates' treasure!" And we row home madly, come back with our spades and our pickaxes, and we start to dig. And we dig, they're strong lads, and we dig like fury. And we get down 2 feet, and we find a flat platform of things like paving stones. So this hole in the ground, which we are now re-excavating, was no freak of nature. Somebody dug it, and somebody put these flat stones across as a protection, perhaps against wind, rain, or whatever, or for some reason or perhaps to indicate that it's really a man-made structure. So the boys take the flat stones out. Incidentally, those stones came from about 3 miles away, a place called Gold River. They were not native to the island. They were not local to the island itself. So somebody has bothered to bring and shape flat stones to roof in this pit. Boys are now getting more excited than ever. They get the stones out. They say, "Hey, I know what's going to happen now. We're going to find the treasure just under here, 2 feet down." Do they hell? They go down another 8 feet. They hit a platform of oak logs, by which time they've noticed this. By the time they get down to the oak logs, which are 10 feet from the surface, 8 feet below the flat slabs, they have noticed that the sides of the pit are brick hard and impermeable, and that they are showing the marks very frequently where somebody has hit them with a pickaxe or a shovel a long time ago when they made the pit. But the stuff that's coming out, which is how they got down so far so fast, the stuff that's coming out is like brown sugar. Gardeners among you, I think the technical term is friable. Friable soil, F-R-I-A-B-L, a lovely word, isn't it? How's your gardener? Very friable today, sir. So they find all this lovely, loose, soft, friable earth, which they take out, and at the 10-foot level, they've hit the oak logs. The oak logs have been carefully embedded into the brick-hard clay. Oh, this must be the treasure. Their names were Smith and Vaughan and McGinnis. And you can imagine them almost doing a dance of triumph on these oak logs. We found it, Eureka! And they took the oak logs out, and there was nothing except more nice, friable soil. They're tough, these Nova Scotian kids. Pioneers. They go down another 10 feet. And they find another platform of oak logs. And they took them out as well, and by this time they're exhausted. And there's nothing but more soil. Eventually an adult expedition comes, and then another one, and another one, and another one. They went down over the last 200 years, one expedition after another, to a depth of 100 feet. And at the 100-foot mark, imagine that this is the shaft, and that that's the beach. At the 100-foot mark, roughly, 2 flood tunnels came into operation. Whoever had built that thing, with its oak logs every few feet, and layers of pitch and putty and charcoal, all sorts of mysterious things, the 2 flood tunnels opened up from the artificial beach which the original builders had created. Pat and I walked on that beach. Somebody went to a great deal of trouble to put a couple of 100 feet of big boulders together so the flood tunnels wouldn't soak up. And nobody, even with all our modern technology, has ever succeeded in beating the flood water or the expense. Whatever is buried in Oak Island is still there. I have no doubt it's something extremely significant and interesting. We have made many visits. I have never retrieved anything from it. I only wish I had. But I'll finish off with the Oak Island legend, which is that the last oak tree must fall and 7 men must be sacrificed to the spirit of the money pit. 6 men are dead. Pat and I were photographing the island in a little diesel-engined motorboat, which was out on its sea trials because nobody else had one available, and it got salt water into its diesel fuel. And with an engineless boat, we were doing this in a lovely Atlantic swell, and we couldn't help saying, I think I may be number 7. I don't know if girls count. You're probably going to be the bonus kid. But it, as I said, the fact that we're here to tell you the story indicates that we did get out, but it was a rather traumatic occasion, shall we say. And the boss doesn't swim, at which point I said, if I can't get you out, kid, I ain't going either. So it wasn't necessary to do all that heroic stuff. We actually got to shore dry. I thought we might have to swim the last bit. The mystery of Oak Island remains. I suspect it's connected with Rennes and with Templar treasure and with the abominable Philip the Bell, and that is 2 minutes to change over speakers.
At the moment, Bernard is running late, so he's not here yet.
Gary tap dancing, or we can have some more vinyl. Which would you rather have?
Would you look?
Come and dance.
Or you can have a half-hour break. Hopefully he'll be here by midday.
Oh, I can see.
The bar is open now.
The bar has now opened. Don't please all run.
Before we go further, round of applause for Lionel, I think.
Yeah.